Every empire that has ever dominated the world believed its supremacy was eternal. The Romans could not imagine a world without their legions. The British assumed the sun would never set on their dominion. Even the Mongols, who conquered more territory than any empire before or since, believed their reign would last 1,000 years. Yet each, in turn, discovered that power is not a possession but a condition, subject to forces larger than military might or economic wealth. Today, we stand at a moment when the global order that has defined our lifetimes faces pressures that previous generations could scarcely imagine. This is not a story about what will happen, but about what could happen if certain trajectories continue, if certain decisions are made, if certain structural realities play out to their logical conclusions. This is the scenario where China becomes not just a superpower, but the world's only superpower by the year 2050. To understand how one nation could stand alone at the apex of global power, we must first understand how superpowers fall. The architecture of decline is rarely visible to those living within it. Citizens of a dominant power experience their everyday lives much as they always have. The trains still run, the shops still open, the currency still spins. But beneath the surface, structural fractures widen. The very systems that enabled rise become the mechanisms of descent. Consider the economic foundations. The United States emerged from the Second World War holding roughly half of the world's economic output and nearly all of its gold reserves. This unprecedented concentration of wealth allowed America to establish the dollar as the world's reserve currency, a privilege that economist Barry Eichengreen once called an exorbitant privilege. For decades, this arrangement worked beautifully. The world needed dollars to conduct trade, which meant perpetual demand for American currency regardless of domestic policy. But this privilege contained a paradox that Belgian economist Robert Triffin identified in 1960. To supply the world with enough dollars for growing international trade, America had to run persistent deficits. Yet running persistent deficits would eventually undermine confidence in the dollar itself. This is the Triffin dilemma, and it has haunted American economic policy for over 6 decades. History offers instructive parallels. In the 3rd century, Rome faced a crisis of currency. To fund endless military campaigns and maintain an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, emperors began debasing their coinage, reducing the silver content of the denarius from nearly pure silver to less than 5% over the course of a single century. Citizens noticed. Inflation ravaged the economy. Trade networks collapsed. The empire fragmented. Or consider Britain after the First World War. The war cost London its financial supremacy. By 1919, Britain owed the United States more money than it could conceivably repay while maintaining its global commitments. The pound sterling, once the unquestioned reserve currency of global trade, began its long decline. Britain tried desperately to maintain its position, returning to the gold standard in 1925 at the pre-war parity, but the economic strain proved too great. The empire that had ruled the waves for 2 centuries found itself unable to afford its own dominance. Today, the United States carries a national debt exceeding $34 trillion, with debt-to-GDP ratios approaching levels historically associated with economic crisis. More concerning than the absolute numbers is the trajectory. Unlike previous periods of high debt, which typically followed major wars and then declined, current projections show debt rising indefinitely. The Congressional Budget Office forecasts debt reaching 200% of GDP by mid-century under current policies. Meanwhile, the structural advantage that once made this debt manageable erodes steadily. China holds over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities, as does Japan. The petrodollar system, which guaranteed demand for dollars by requiring oil purchases in American currency, faces challenges as major producers explore alternatives. Russia and China have quietly increased bilateral trade settled in yuan. Saudi Arabia has discussed pricing some oil sales in currencies other than dollars. Each of these developments alone might seem minor, but together they represent a fundamental shift in the architecture of global finance. Europe faces its own structural crisis, though different in character. The European Union, an unprecedented experiment in supranational governance, struggles with contradictions embedded in its design. A common currency without a common fiscal policy creates asymmetries that the euro crisis exposed brutally. Germany runs perpetual surpluses While southern European nations struggle with debt they cannot inflate away, trapped in a monetary union that serves some members far better than others. Beyond economics, demography poses an existential challenge. Italy's population is projected to decline from 60 million today to fewer than 45 million by the end of this century. Germany faces similar trajectories. An aging, shrinking population means fewer workers to support growing numbers of retirees, straining social welfare systems that Europeans consider fundamental to their way of life. Immigration might offset demographic decline, but current political trends suggest European publics have limited appetite for the scale of immigration that would be required. The political dimension of Western decline operates on a different, but equally important register. Democracy, for all its moral and philosophical virtues, contains structural features that can impede long-term strategic planning. Electoral cycles reward short-term thinking. A politician facing re-election in 4 years has powerful incentives to prioritize immediate, visible benefits over investments that might pay off in decades. Infrastructure projects that take 20 years to complete rarely attract the same political enthusiasm as tax cuts or spending programs that voters can feel immediately. Alexis de Tocqueville identified this tendency nearly 2 centuries ago, warning that democracy might privilege the urgent over the important, the immediate over the enduring. Contemporary political science has documented what researchers call affective polarization, the tendency for partisans to view political opponents not just as wrong, but as threats. In the United States, studies show Republicans and Democrats now harbor more negative feelings toward the opposing party than at any point since such measurements began. France has seen the rise of political movements on both left and right that reject the centrist consensus that governed for decades. Germany's political landscape has fragmented, with traditional parties losing support to populist alternatives. This polarization makes governance more difficult. Coalition building becomes harder. Compromise feels like betrayal. The result is often gridlock, an inability to make major decisions even when circumstances demand them. History again provides context. The Weimar Republic, Germany's democratic experiment between the world wars, featured 14 major political parties represented in parliament. Coalition governments formed and collapsed with dizzying frequency. Faced with economic crisis and political paralysis, many Germans concluded that democracy itself was the problem, a tragic misdiagnosis that opened the door to totalitarianism. The late Roman Republic offers another cautionary tale. As political competition between optimates and populares intensified, normal governance became impossible. Each faction viewed the other as an existential threat. The result was a century of civil wars that ended the republic and established the empire. The lesson is not that democracy inevitably fails, but that pluralism can become paralysis when political culture breaks down. Military overextension compounds these economic and political vulnerabilities. The United States maintains over 750 military installations in more than 80 countries. This vast network requires enormous resources to sustain. Economist Paul Kennedy, in his influential study of great powers, identified a recurring pattern. Successful empires expand their commitments during periods of relative strength, but those commitments become unsustainable as economic vitality fades. Spain learned this lesson painfully in the 16th and 17th centuries. Its formidable tercios, the best infantry in Europe, bled themselves white trying to suppress rebellion in the Netherlands while simultaneously fighting France, England, and the Ottoman Empire. The treasure from American silver mines, which should have made Spain the richest nation on earth, flowed through Madrid to pay for wars that ultimately achieved nothing. The Soviet Union's experience in Afghanistan demonstrated the same principle in modern form. A superpower with nuclear weapons and the world's largest army found itself unable to pacify a poor, landlocked country. The war drained resources, demoralized the military, and contributed to the Soviet system's eventual collapse. The American withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021 might, in retrospect, mark a similar turning point. After 20 years, trillions of dollars, and thousands of lives, the Afghan government collapsed in a matter of days. The images of Afghans clinging to departing aircraft recalled Saigon in 1975, suggesting not just a tactical defeat, but a strategic exhaustion. When empires can no longer sustain their commitments, When the costs exceed the benefits by such obvious margins, withdrawal becomes inevitable. But each withdrawal creates a vacuum, and vacuums invite new powers to fill them. As one system strains under its own weight, another has been methodically building foundations. China's approach to global power differs fundamentally from the Western model, reflecting different historical experiences, different philosophical traditions, and different strategic calculations. Where the United States built its post-war order on military alliances and democratic ideology, China is constructing something more subtle, a web of economic dependencies and institutional influence that could prove more durable than aircraft carriers. The Belt and Road Initiative represents the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history. Launched in 2013, it now encompasses over 150 countries and international organizations. The scale is difficult to comprehend. Estimates of total investment range from $1 trillion to $8 trillion over the coming decades. To put this in perspective, the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Western Europe after World War II and is often credited with cementing American influence for a generation, cost roughly $130 billion in today's currency. China is spending multiples of that amount, not on reconstruction after war, but on building new trade routes, ports, railways, highways, and power plants across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe. The strategic logic becomes clear when we examine specific projects. In Greece, China acquired a majority stake in the port of Piraeus, transforming it into a major gateway for Chinese goods entering Europe. In Sri Lanka, the port of Hambantota, built with Chinese loans, was leased to a Chinese company for 99 years when Sri Lanka could not meet its debt obligations. In Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor involves over $60 billion in infrastructure investment, creating a direct route from Western China to the Arabian Sea. Each of these projects serves immediate economic purposes, but their aggregate effect is to make China indispensable to global trade flows. This strategy echoes historical patterns. The British Empire used railway construction in India not just to extract resources, but to create dependencies that made independence almost unthinkable to colonial administrators. Rails required British engineers, British capital, British governance. The American Marshall Plan similarly created dependencies, though more benign. European recovery required American aid, American exports, American security guarantees. Recipients became invested in American success. China's Belt and Road Initiative operates on the same principle, but at a scale and geographic scope that dwarfs previous efforts. Economic theory helps explain why this strategy proves so effective. Network effects mean that the value of a network increases exponentially as more participants join. The first telephone was worthless. A million telephones created revolutionary communication possibilities. Similarly, the more countries that integrate their infrastructure with Chinese standards, use Chinese technology, and rely on Chinese financing, the more costly it becomes for any individual country to opt out. This is what economists call lock-in, and it creates powerful path dependencies that shape choices for decades. Cultural and psychological factors reinforce these economic realities. Anthropologist Marcel Mauss documented how gift-giving in traditional societies created obligations that transcended economic value. To receive a gift required reciprocation, not immediately, but when the giver needed assistance. Chinese diplomacy understands this principle deeply. Infrastructure investment is presented not as self-interested strategy, but as partnership, friendship, mutual benefit. When China builds a port in Tanzania or a railway in Kenya, the symbolism matters as much as the economic utility. These are gifts from one developing nation to another, based on solidarity rather than condescension. Whether or not this framing is entirely accurate, it resonates in countries that experienced Western colonialism or Cold War-era interference. The contrast with Western approaches is deliberate and pointed. Where the World Bank or International Monetary Fund might attach conditions about governance, labor rights, or environmental standards, Chinese financing typically comes with minimal interference in domestic affairs. This reflects a principle that China articulates consistently: non-interference in the internal matters of sovereign states. For authoritarian governments or countries wary of Western pressure on human rights, this approach has obvious appeal. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Myanmar, and dozens of other nations have found in China a partner that provides resources without lectures about democracy or transparency. Some Western analysts describe this as debt trap diplomacy, accusing China of deliberately overlending to gain control of strategic assets. Chinese officials reject this characterization, pointing out that debt restructuring and forgiveness have been common when countries face difficulties. The truth likely lies somewhere between. China clearly pursues strategic interests through the Belt and Road Initiative, but characterizing it as purely predatory ignores the genuine development that has occurred in the agency of recipient countries in choosing Chinese partnerships. What matters for our scenario is not moral judgment, but practical consequence. China is building a global economic infrastructure oriented toward Beijing. Technological dominance provides the second pillar of Chinese strategy. Control over critical technologies may prove more important in the 21st century than control over natural resources or territory was in previous eras. China has invested massively in becoming the leader, not just a participant, in key technologies that will define the global economy for decades. Consider fifth-generation wireless networks, the infrastructure that will enable everything from autonomous vehicles to smart cities to the Internet of Things. Chinese companies, particularly Huawei and ZTE, have become the dominant global suppliers of 5G equipment. Despite American pressure on allies to exclude Chinese firms from their networks, many countries have proceeded with Chinese technology. The reasons are simple. It works, it's cheaper than alternatives, and in many cases it's more advanced. Britain, Germany, and other European nations have incorporated Huawei equipment into their networks despite security concerns raised by Washington. This is not just about telecommunications. 5G infrastructure creates dependencies similar to the Belt and Road Initiative. Once a country builds its network on Chinese equipment, switching becomes prohibitively expensive. More importantly, China can begin setting standards for how these networks operate globally. Artificial intelligence represents another domain where China has achieved rough parity with the United States and in some areas has pulled ahead. China's advantages are structural. A population of over 1,400,000,000 people generates data at scales American companies cannot match. Facial recognition systems in China process images of more faces daily than exist in many entire countries. This data advantage, combined with government coordination of research priorities and willingness to invest without immediate profit expectations, has produced rapid advances. Chinese AI can now diagnose certain medical conditions more accurately than human doctors, predict traffic patterns in complex urban environments, and recognize individuals from gait analysis alone. Quantum computing, green technology, and battery production tell similar stories. China produces roughly 80% of the world's solar panels and dominates battery manufacturing for electric vehicles. As the global economy transitions away from fossil fuels, this dominance positions China much as control of oil reserves positioned Middle Eastern nations in the 20th century. The country that controls the production of batteries and solar panels controls the means of production for clean energy, creating dependencies that could last generations. The strategic insight driving this technological push is simple but profound. Made in China 2025 must become China's standards 2035. It is not enough to manufacture products designed elsewhere. To achieve true technological sovereignty, China must set the standards that others follow. History shows that standard setters enjoy enormous advantages. Britain's Industrial Revolution gave it not just a manufacturing edge, but the ability to define industrial processes globally. America's dominance in computing and the internet allowed it to establish protocols and architectures that still govern digital communications worldwide. If China establishes the standards for 5G, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and clean energy technology, the rest of the world will build systems that interface with Chinese specifications, further embedding Chinese influence into the global technological infrastructure. This technological strategy reflects lessons from China's century of humiliation, the period from roughly 1840 to 1949 when foreign powers dominated Chinese affairs. The memory of this era, kept vivid in Chinese education and political discourse, generates powerful motivation. Never again will China depend on foreign technology. Never again will it be unable to defend its interests because it lacks industrial capacity. This is not merely nationalistic rhetoric, but a framework that explains enormous investment in technological self-sufficiency, even when short-term economic logic might suggest relying on foreign suppliers. Institutional transformation provides the third pillar. China has methodically created alternative international institutions that operate on different principles than the Western-led order established after World War II. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, founded in 2016, was initially opposed by the United States, which pressured allies not to join. Despite this pressure, over 100 countries have joined, including major American allies like Britain, Germany, Australia, and South Korea. The AIB provides an alternative to the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, institutions long dominated by Western countries and Western priorities. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization serves as a security architecture encompassing China, Russia, India, Pakistan, and several Central Asian states, covering roughly 40% of the world's population. Unlike NATO, which requires democratic governance and collective defense obligations, the SCO focuses on counterterrorism and security cooperation without demanding particular forms of government. This makes it attractive to authoritarian states and countries wary of Western-dominated alliances. China has also accumulated leadership positions in United Nations agencies with remarkably little international attention. The Food and Agriculture Organization, International Telecommunication Union, International Civil Aviation Organization, and United Nations Industrial Development Organization are all currently headed by Chinese nationals. These positions allow China to shape international rules and norms in ways that serve Chinese interests while maintaining the appearance of multilateral governance. The historical pattern is clear. Hegemonic powers write the rules of international order. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 established principles of state sovereignty that European powers then imposed globally through colonialism. The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 created institutions that reflected American power and American preferences for how the global economy should function. If China becomes the dominant power, it will similarly reshape international institutions to reflect Chinese interests and Chinese values. This reshaping has already begun. The principle of non-interference in internal affairs, human rights defined more collectively and less individually, state sovereignty privileged over humanitarian intervention. These Chinese positions gain adherence as Chinese influence grows. But economic and technological power alone do not guarantee supremacy. Military capacity provides the final guarantee. A country might dominate trade and technology, but without the ability to protect its interests through force or the credible threat of force, that dominance remains vulnerable. China has invested enormous resources in transforming its military from a large, but technologically backward force designed for territorial defense into an advanced military capable of projecting power globally. The anti-access area denial strategy represents the first phase of this transformation. Rather than attempting to match American aircraft carriers and overseas bases immediately, China focused on making it prohibitively risky for American forces to operate near Chinese shores. The DF-21D and DF-26 missiles, dubbed carrier killers, can theoretically strike moving ships at ranges exceeding 2,000 kilometers. Whether these weapons would perform as advertised in actual combat remains uncertain, but their existence changes strategic calculations. An American aircraft carrier costs roughly $13 billion and carries over 5,000 personnel. The political and economic cost of losing even one carrier would be staggering. If China can hold American carriers at risk with missiles costing a tiny fraction of what the carriers cost, the strategic balance shifts fundamentally. Hypersonic missiles compound this challenge. Unlike traditional ballistic missiles, which follow predictable parabolic trajectories, hypersonic weapons maneuver during flight at speeds exceeding 5 times the speed of sound. Current American missile defense systems were not designed to intercept such weapons. China has tested hypersonic systems extensively and may have deployed operational versions. This creates psychological as well as military pressure. American naval commanders must now factor in the possibility that their ships could be struck with little warning by weapons they cannot reliably defend against. Control of the South China Sea advances through what strategists call salami slicing, making incremental gains too small to justify military response individually but transformative in aggregate. China has built artificial islands on reefs and atolls, transforming them into military bases complete with runways, radar installations, and missile batteries. International legal rulings against these activities have been ignored. Neighboring countries protest, but lack the power to reverse what China has accomplished. The United States conducts freedom of navigation operations, sailing warships through contested waters. But these symbolic gestures do not change the physical reality that China now controls key shipping lanes through which 1/3 of global maritime trade flows. This strategy has historical precedent. Germany's construction of a high-seas fleet in the early 20th century challenged British naval supremacy without directly attacking British ships. Kaiser Wilhelm II understood that Britain could not maintain its empire without control of the seas. So creating a German navy powerful enough to threaten that control gave Germany leverage in European affairs. The construction program itself generated tensions that contributed to the outbreak of World War I, a cautionary tale about the risks of great power competition. But it also demonstrated that a rising power could change the strategic balance through sustained military investment even when starting from a position of inferiority. The second phase of China's military transformation involves building a blue water navy capable of operating globally, not just regionally. China already possesses more ships than the United States Navy, though many are smaller vessels suited for coastal operations. The qualitative gap is closing rapidly. China commissioned its first aircraft carrier in 2012, its second in 2019, and has launched a third. Projections suggest 6 carriers by 2040, a fleet approaching the size America maintained during the Cold War. Each carrier represents not just combat capability, but a statement of global ambition. Carriers exist to project power far from home shores. Overseas bases support this blue water capability. China established its first official overseas military base in Djibouti in 2017, a facility that supports anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, but also positions Chinese forces at a strategic choke point through which much Middle Eastern oil flows toward Asian markets. Cambodia appears to be developing facilities that could host Chinese naval forces. Pakistan's Gwadar port, built with Chinese financing, includes provisions for potential military use. The Solomon Islands signed a security agreement with China that could allow Chinese naval vessels to dock and refuel, positioning Chinese forces in the Pacific far closer to Australia and American territories than previously possible. The strategic purpose is straightforward: protecting global supply chains. China imports roughly 70% of its oil, much of it from the Middle East. Those tankers must traverse the Indian Ocean, pass through the Straits of Malacca, and cross the South China Sea. If hostile powers could interdict this route, they could strangle the Chinese economy without firing a shot at Chinese territory. A global navy ensures that such interdiction becomes impossible, or at least too costly to attempt. This mirrors American strategic thinking for over a century. The United States maintains a global military presence primarily to ensure open sea lanes for commerce. As China's economy globalizes, Chinese strategists have drawn the same conclusion. Shipbuilding capacity provides China with an enormous structural advantage. Chinese shipyards can produce warships at a rate that American yards cannot match. Some estimates suggest Chinese shipbuilding capacity exceeds American capacity by more than 200 times when measured in tonnage. This means that in any sustained naval competition, China can simply outbuild potential rivals. During World War II, American industrial capacity proved decisive in both the Pacific and Atlantic theaters. The United States produced ships, aircraft, and weapons faster than enemies could destroy them. China may now possess a similar advantage, raising troubling questions about American ability to maintain naval supremacy in a protracted great power competition. Nuclear parity and space dominance represent the final elements of military transformation. China has historically maintained a relatively small nuclear arsenal, estimated at around 350 warheads in 2020, far fewer than the several thousand maintained by the United States and Russia. This expansion changes strategic dynamics fundamentally. When one power possesses overwhelming nuclear superiority, it retains escalation dominance, the ability to threaten nuclear use in a crisis knowing the adversary cannot respond in kind. Once both sides possess arsenals sufficient to ensure mutual destruction, this advantage disappears. Neither side can credibly threaten nuclear war because both would be annihilated. Paradoxically, this may make conventional conflict more likely by removing the ultimate deterrent. Space has become a critical military domain. China's Beidou navigation system provides an alternative to American GPS, ensuring that Chinese military forces can operate even if denied access to American satellites. Counter-satellite weapons give China the capability to destroy or disable enemy satellites, potentially blinding American surveillance and communication systems. The Chinese lunar program, which has landed rovers on the far side of the moon and plans to establish a lunar base, combines scientific prestige with potential military implications. Controlling lunar resources or establishing permanent facilities on the moon could provide strategic advantages that are difficult to predict but potentially significant. Military might secures interests, but cultural influence wins hearts and minds, or at least acquiescence. A world order dominated by China would reflect Chinese values, Chinese priorities, and Chinese assumptions about how societies should organize themselves. Understanding what this might mean requires moving beyond economics and military power to consider questions of governance, rights, and human flourishing. Economic realignment would be the most immediate and visible change. The renminbi replacing the dollar as the world's reserve currency would shift enormous power to Beijing. Imagine oil transactions conducted in yuan rather than dollars. Saudi Arabia, Russia, and other major producers would hold Chinese currency reserves rather than American treasury bonds. This would end the exorbitant privilege that has allowed the United States to run persistent deficits without the consequences other countries would face. But it would also create new dependencies. Countries holding large yuan reserves would have strong incentives to align their policies with Chinese preferences to maintain the value of those holdings. The International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights might become dominated by the renminbi, allowing China to influence bailout packages and structural adjustment programs in ways that favor Chinese interests. Capital controls, which China has maintained throughout its economic rise, might gradually lift as Chinese dominance becomes secure, allowing the yuan to flow freely for international transactions while remaining under state supervision domestically. Winners and losers would emerge from this realignment. The global south might benefit significantly. China's stated preference for infrastructure investment over conditional lending could channel resources to development projects that Western institutions historically underfunded. The principle of non-interference might allow governments to pursue economic strategies tailored to local conditions rather than following one-size-fits-all prescriptions. However, this same non-interference principle would provide cover for authoritarian governments to suppress dissent without international consequences. Advanced democracies would face constrained autonomy. Small nations dependent on Chinese trade and investment would find their foreign policy options limited. Criticizing Chinese human rights practices could result in economic retaliation. Supporting separatist movements in Tibet, Xinjiang, or Taiwan could mean losing access to Chinese markets. Even large economies like Germany or Japan would face difficult choices between values and interests. Political norms would shift in profound ways. The tension between sovereignty and human rights has defined international relations since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Western countries have generally argued that egregious human rights violations justify international intervention, even without the consent of the affected state. The responsibility to protect doctrine, endorsed by the United Nations in 2005, codified this principle, asserting that when states fail to protect their populations from atrocities, the international community has a responsibility to intervene. China has consistently opposed this doctrine, arguing for a stricter interpretation of Westphalian sovereignty. States have the right to govern their territories without external interference regardless of how they treat their populations. This position has philosophical roots in communitarianism, the idea that communities rather than individuals are the fundamental units of moral concern. It also reflects China's own historical experience with foreign intervention and a genuine belief that Western human rights concepts represent cultural imperialism rather than universal values. Under Chinese hegemony, the responsibility to protect would likely be abandoned. The International Criminal Court, already weakened by American and Russian refusal to participate, would become largely irrelevant. Authoritarian governments from Myanmar to Venezuela to Belarus would operate with less international pressure to moderate their behavior. Whether this represents a return to realistic respect for sovereignty or an abandonment of universal human rights depends on one's philosophical commitments. Philosopher John Rawls argued for universal principles of justice. Economist Amartya Sen suggested that capabilities and freedoms have universal value across cultures. But other thinkers, including many in post-colonial studies, have questioned whether Western concepts of individual rights should be imposed on societies with different traditions and priorities. The practical implications extend beyond philosophy. Dissidents, journalists, and activists who currently find refuge in Western countries or support from international organizations might find themselves isolated. Governments could suppress opposition movements without fear of sanctions or international condemnation. Civil society organizations dependent on Western funding might wither. The slow expansion of democratic governance that characterized the late 20th century might reverse. Information and identity would be reshaped by technologies of surveillance and control. China's social credit system, which monitors citizen behavior and assigns scores that affect access to services, employment opportunities, and travel rights, represents a new form of governance enabled by digital technology. Facial recognition cameras, online activity monitoring, and integration of data from multiple sources create a panopticon beyond anything George Orwell imagined when he wrote 1984. If China exports this governance model, the implications are profound. Facial recognition systems are already being sold to dozens of countries. Internet censorship architecture modeled on China's Great Firewall has been adopted by authoritarian governments from Vietnam to Saudi Arabia. Social credit algorithms could be adapted to local contexts, creating societies where the state knows everything about everyone and uses that information to shape behavior. Psychological research on surveillance suggests such systems change behavior even when people are not consciously aware of being watched. Michel Foucault's analysis of the panopticon, a prison design where guards can observe all inmates without inmates knowing when they are being watched, revealed that the possibility of surveillance produces self-discipline. People internalize the watcher's gaze and regulate their own behavior. The Milgram experiments on obedience to authority and Ash's work on conformity demonstrate how social pressure shapes individual action. Combine omnipresent surveillance with social credit consequences, and you create conditions for unprecedented behavioral control. Cultural assumptions about privacy would shift. In Western liberal thought, privacy is fundamental to human dignity and autonomy. The private sphere is where individuals develop their authentic selves, free from social performance and judgment. But other philosophical traditions view privacy differently. Confucian thought emphasizes social harmony and the individual's obligations to community. From this perspective, privacy might be less a fundamental right than a Western luxury, and transparency might be reframed as accountability to the collective. Whether prosperity without freedom proves stable long-term is an open question. Singapore suggests the model can work at small scale with specific cultural conditions. China's own economic success, while maintaining political control, challenges assumptions that democracy and capitalism inevitably coincide. But Singapore is a city-state of 6 million, and China's control depends partly on economic growth that may not continue indefinitely. Historical examples of prosperous authoritarianism are rare and often temporary. Every vision of the future reveals as much about the present as what may come. This scenario is not destiny but possibility, not prophecy but extrapolation. Contingencies could derail everything described here. China faces its own profound vulnerabilities. Demographic collapse might be the most severe. China's one-child policy, though officially ended, created a population structure that will invert over coming decades. By 2100, China's population could fall from 1.4 billion to 1 billion or fewer, a loss of 400 million people. More critically, the working-age population will shrink dramatically while the elderly population expands. This creates an economic trap. Fewer workers must support more retirees while also maintaining the investment and consumption that drives growth. Japan's lost decades offer a preview of how demographic decline undermines economic dynamism. Taiwan represents an immediate crisis point. Chinese leaders have made clear that unification with Taiwan is non-negotiable, by force if necessary. But Taiwan is defended by difficult geography, a mobilized population, and implicit American security guarantees. An invasion could succeed militarily, but at costs that would undermine everything else China hopes to achieve. Damage to the Taiwanese economy would harm Chinese interests. American and allied responses could include comprehensive sanctions that cut China off from global markets. The risk of escalation to broader conflict, potentially nuclear, makes Taiwan the most dangerous flashpoint in contemporary geopolitics. Environmental catastrophe could make China's rise moot. Water scarcity threatens major urban areas and agricultural regions. Air quality in Chinese cities improved significantly over the past decade, but pollution levels remain higher than most developed countries. Climate change affects China severely. Rising sea levels threaten coastal cities where much of China's economic activity concentrates. Desertification expands in the north and west. If environmental degradation accelerates beyond the government's capacity to manage it, social stability could fracture. Internal political tensions simmer beneath the surface. China is not homogeneous. Ethnic minorities in Tibet and Xinjiang have experienced harsh repression. Provincial loyalties sometimes supersede national identity. The Communist Party maintains control through a combination of economic performance, nationalist appeals, and surveillance. But this formula depends on continued success. An economic crisis or major foreign policy failure could test the regime's resilience in ways that are difficult to predict. The middle-income trap has caught many developing countries. As economies grow and wages rise, they lose competitiveness in manufacturing but struggle to transition to high-value services and innovation. China has managed this transition better than most, but the endpoint is not assured. Without continued economic growth, the social contract that trades political freedom for rising living standards could collapse. Human agency shapes history more than structural forces. Western renewal is possible. The United States underwent profound transformation in the 1930s, creating social programs and regulatory frameworks that enabled decades of prosperity. Britain established the National Health Service and welfare state after World War II despite being nearly bankrupt. Nations can reform when circumstances demand it. If Western democracies recognize the depth of their challenges and mobilize political will to address them, decline is not inevitable. Chinese hubris and overreach represent another contingency. Every hegemon overextends eventually. Rome conquered more than it could govern. Napoleon's empire collapsed within 15 years of its zenith. Success breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds mistakes. If China miscalculates in its foreign policy, alienates too many countries simultaneously, or attempts to expand influence faster than capabilities allow, the entire project could unravel. Technology could transform everything in ways no one anticipates. Artificial general intelligence, if achieved, would make current power calculations irrelevant. Breakthroughs in fusion power or carbon capture could solve environmental crises and shift economic fundamentals. Pandemics worse than COVID-19 could devastate populations and scramble international order. The future is not a straight line from present conditions. Generational changes within China itself might reshape the nation's trajectory. Young Chinese educated abroad, exposed to different political systems and cultural values, might press for reforms their parents' generation did not demand. As China becomes wealthier and its citizens more connected to global culture, maintaining the current political model may become more difficult. Every authoritarian regime believes it can control information and shape consciousness, but history suggests such control ultimately fails when people have examples of alternative possibilities. Philosophical frameworks help us think about these dynamics without pretending to predict outcomes. Hegel's dialectic suggests that thesis and antithesis produce synthesis. American hegemony as thesis, challenged by multipolarity as antithesis, might produce a synthesis we cannot yet imagine. Perhaps a world not dominated by any single power, but also not descending into chaos. Ibn Khaldun, writing in the 14th century, described cycles of civilization driven by asabiya, group solidarity. Dynasties rise when they possess strong cohesion, conquer, grow prosperous, lose their solidarity and comfort, and then decline, to be replaced by the next group with strong asabiya. This cyclical view challenges progressive narratives that assume history moves in one direction. Perhaps Chinese rise and Western decline simply represent the latest turn of a wheel that will continue turning long after both civilizations transform beyond recognition. The human constant across all these scenarios is that power attracts and absolute power corrupts. China may escape the patterns that trapped previous hegemons, but this would be unprecedented. More likely, Chinese dominance would eventually face the same contradictions, the same overextension, the same internal decay that brought down every previous empire. Perhaps the real question is not whether China could become the sole superpower, but whether any nation should hold that position again. The unipolar moment after the Soviet collapse lasted barely a generation before its limitations became apparent. Hegemonic stability theory suggests that one dominant power can provide public,